Many people are saying, I give up. The human race deserves to extinguish itself. People are greedy and by nature. And so you have both this sort of sense of giving up, and then you also have quite a lot of discourse now, which I think is coming from well-funded think tanks, which argues that all these Westerners have been told about the huge damage they're doing to the environment by driving their cars and consuming the way they do. And now, even though all the warning signs are there about global warming and climate change, they're doing nothing. What's wrong with these people? And there's a very common message out there that says, well, people don't learn from information. They've been informed about climate change, and then still there they are, not changing their light bulbs, still driving their cars. And I think that both of these ways of thinking, the one that human beings are aggressive and greedy by nature and they just deserve to extinguish themselves. Information, they're continuing the merry old way. They don't want to change. Both of these ideas are, from my point of view, completely misguided. People are missing the point, and the big point is that we have a technoeconomic, I should say, technoeconomic, politico-economic system that is so big that people can't see its contours, and they don't address that system. They don't discuss it, they don't highlight it, and end up operating narrow tunnels, trying essentially to deal with symptoms, and I think making the huge mistake of blaming individual human beings for the problem rather than looking at the need for systemic change. Now, I would love to hear, Bayo, what you would say about that. You agree that the problem is looking at the big system, and I talk about what I call big picture activism. We really need to become familiar with that big system, understand it, and communicate to people just how destructive it is and how one of its manifestations is to shape how we think, how we see the world, and to take us down narrow tunnels that, unfortunately, if we don't change, will take us to the brink of extinction, if not extinction.
Thank you, Helena. Let me start by saying this, that well, let me start in the ways that my own parents taught me to start, I think. And I'm sure my mother would approve if she were here listening as well. That I acknowledge, and there's a proverb in Africa. It says that the children that stand today stand on the shoulders of their elders. And I just want to acknowledge the work that you have done over the years. The work that I do now is as a result of that. And your voice is strong and powerful the way we see our most urgent crises in the world right now. So I just want to acknowledge that and say that I do not take this invitation lightly, and I thank you for inviting me to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Now let's dive in. You mentioned something about the how people are getting disenchanted from activism today, and people are saying it's not working or stuff like that. And I know over the years that I've come to know you and your work, you've always insisted that the issue really is that we pay attention to this techno-economic political framework that is like a monstrous elephant in the room, so to speak, taking up all the space and displacing everything else. But yeah, I really acknowledge that, and it's central to my thinking. But there's also a sense in which I feel some kind of a deeper revolution is being called for, something that might re-engineer our response to the crises of today. So one of the questions that I like to ask is, what if the way we approach the crisis, a crisis without a name, and I know we'll dive into that, all the talk about the Anthropocene and all that. What if the way we approach the crisis is part of the crisis? And what if we are living in times where a deeper kind of response is required to approach or even engage the systemic issues we have today? And I like to say to people that we are living in a lisp right now. And by that, I mean our old ideas about how to respond, our old ideas about what is final and true and taken for granted and given and certain, all those ideas are imploding, so that even the modern creature that we conveniently call activism is starting to double down on itself or fold back on itself to realize that it may be part of the structure that it's trying to challenge. So all these raise new questions for me, and I don't think I have answers for every one of them or solutions, but I have vital questions. And those questions move in the theme of, or in the way of trying to understand how or what has been displaced or excluded in the way we see the problems today, and what is being called for as we march forward into the future. So yeah, that's some kind of first response, I guess.
Well, I think that I'm certainly saying that the way that activists have generally operated has been very much part of the system, because it's been essentially shaped by the same reductionism, the same narrow view that is what has created this system in the first place. And I think that in terms of the activism that we are recommending in Local Futures, we believe that we need to be looking in two opposing directions at the same time. And I tend to call that resistance and renewal, that it can really help us to clarify and to become, I believe, less confused if we understand that we need to differentiate between what is the system that is threatening life on Earth and that is threatening our well-being and, of course, the well-being of everything that lives. Understanding that system and resisting the expansion of that system is a very, very different activity from renewing, reawakening, rebirthing a way of being in this world. That is really the way that we evolved. People from the beginning of time lived in much greater proximity to the living world. They lived in much greater proximity to each other. They were embedded or localized in living ecosystems. They had a relational way of being. The rhythm of life was also very different. The spatial difference was much more localized, much more intimate. In terms of time, the rhythm of life was a rhythm that was exactly that, the rhythm of living human beings in collaboration and interdependence with the living world. Recovering that and learning and enjoying the process of reawakening or renewing is a very, very important part of what needs to happen. But I'm quite worried about the tendency for many people now to believe that just becoming indigenous again is something that can happen quickly enough and on a scale that's going to be meaningful enough to contend with and to deconstruct the dominant system. So I think there is this very important distinction to be made, and I think we need to inhabit these two different worlds more or less simultaneously. I would recommend for most people that we sort of practice inhabiting the resistance part for certainly not for the entire day, absolutely not for an entire month or year. It might be that that resistance activity requires something that goes beyond the day. But even then, there's a way we can move in and out. It's really a moving in and out that's very akin to the teachings of meditation, the sort of meditation where we can learn literally from one moment to the next to allow our mind to rest in that deeper place and then come back to the frontal lobe where we are more reductionist, analytical, speedy, intellectualized. It's left brain versus right brain. So I think we can move in and out. And I think there is a very, very important discussion to be had about the different forms of activism, if you like, because it requires a type of activism to renew those deeper relationships as well. And I know for me, there are many elements in that renewal activism. I think the most frightening for most Western people and most Westernized people, which, you and I both are Bayo, is the vulnerability that's needed, the vulnerability, the humility, the acceptance of not being perfect, of not trying to put on a veneer, put on a show of perfection, whether it's perfect happiness or perfect skills, and being able to be vulnerable. That's one of the big stumbling blocks, I think, for most Westernized people in terms of reconnecting in a deep and meaningful way. And this is a very important part of the renewal activism. But I do worry that some of the things you're saying, Bayo, don't allow for or don't address the need for the resistance side of things. And I'm arguing there that the most important resistance is waking up to the way this system operates and sharing that vision, an activist way of seeing education as activism. It's not about going out and hanging banners from buildings or right now getting arrested, because we need to build up a people's movement that will strongly and clearly know what they don't want, but also clearly what they do want. What is that shift in direction that we need?
Okay, so there's I have a lot of questions about the binary. The binary, it seems to be a dichotomization of renewal versus resistance. And I question if renewal isn't some form of resistance, at least from an indigenous point of view. And let me just see if I could sophisticate that. So I've been doing a lot of traveling lately, and I remember I was in Berlin a few months ago, and I was there to give a keynote on, I called it, what if, something about mountains. What if mountains, oh, I've forgotten the title, just something about mountains and activism, and how listening to mountains could actually be a form of activism. And I remember taking a walk. So we invited everyone to take a walk afterwards, the hosts, that is. And I remember us taking a walk down the streets of Berlin, and a lady pulled over to me and said she felt she was not being acknowledged there, and that there seems to be this overly professionalized category of activists that can speak, and people like her who just care about bees and love bees and wake up to the morning and just want to be in that space are are kind of displaced. And it speaks to one of the tensions that I feel around modern contemporary activism today. You mentioned that with the system we live in is a techno-economic political, I would add epistemological as well. The very way it's framed, the very way the crisis is framed and produced, I would say, caters to a certain kind of power. The academics would call it white power, almost as if you could call it a gentrification of political action. It's like this is the problem and this is the frame. We speak about anthropology, and it's a mega concept right now, Anthropocene. I'm sure you've heard about it. Helena. The whole idea of the Anthropocene is that men or man is the problem on the planet today. And if we could just get rid of that kind of activity, then we're settled or we're solved or all our problems will just vanish. But in a sense, it obfuscates, it just melts the entire mankind and makes everyone complicit for the problems we're facing today. That framing. It makes the Niger Delta people of Nigeria who are suffering from Shell's oil leakage and Shell's exploitation just as complicit as Shell itself, or the people in the Laguna, the off coast town in Brazil, just as complicit as the people in on Wall Street. And what it does further than that is to that concept, that framing, it invites us to think that the world is an agential monologue. And let me see if I can make that a bit clearer. It invites us to see us to think that we are the only ones that are causing problems, so to speak, and we are the ones that should fix it. It's a very humanist framing that positions power and agency and responsibility and causality in this anthropos figure, whereas indigenous elders or indigenous traditions will teach that we are the web of life. Man is so porous that the binary system that says man is different from the non-human world is totally off point. It's totally wrong. And so, all of this just to say that, and going back to what I said about a deeper revolution, is that there is a framing of the problem that kind of excludes other ways of seeing the problem or engaging the problem. For instance, in Nigeria, they'll say, well, in some part of Africa, I think in Senegal, and I repeat this everywhere I go, that the times are urgent, let us slow down. It's a wholly different way of framing urgency that doesn't frame it in terms of apocalypse or something about to happen. It frames it in terms of cultivating responsibility with the non-human world, with the other. And maybe that's what I feel is being called for right now. A kind of sitting down, a sitting still that doesn't feed into that power, that same old binary of activism, where activism is just an orphaned child of the modern framework that we live in. And it calls for a different kind of activism. A friend of mine will call it an activism of the skin. But let's go ahead. Let's dive deeper. I want to see how you respond to that.
Well, I mean, it's so strange because I think we're in so much agreement, and yet there is that sense.
Yeah.
So first of all, I completely agree with you about the Anthropocene, and you're, I think, saying the same thing I started off talking about, which is, I would frame it a little bit differently, which is essentially allowing the monocultural hegemony to erase cultural differences completely. As you say, whether it's the people in Nigeria or elsewhere, suddenly we're talking about humankind as one thing, one homogeneous monocultural entity. And so out of the Western system comes this generalized view of human nature when we should be looking at a specific culture. And it's a specific culture that grew out of precisely this technoeconomic dynamic that I'm talking about. Fundamental to that technoeconomic dynamic is this overly reductionist worldview. And from that overly reductionist worldview, what grew out was larger and larger techno-economic structures, which have now become so big that they threaten Gaia herself. And I think what you're ignoring, as I think a lot of postmodern people do, is they deconstruct everything under the sun, but they don't deconstruct that originally Western-made system, which has now become completely globalized. It's being promoted by the leaders in Nigeria as much as it is by leaders everywhere. So we have this global north global South situation, and both in the North and the South, the majority of people have not been part of creating and pushing that system. And that's where I think it's so important that we look at the history of it, we look at the trajectory of it, and we realize that particularly since the Second World War, in the name of integrating, harmonizing, developing, progress, in the name of all of this, what was happening was, particularly dramatically after the Second World War, when the World Bank and the IMF were set up, so was the GATT. And this GATT, this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, became this quiet process of so-called integrating all the activities around the globe under one umbrella, under the IMF and World Bank umbrella. So these trade treaties have been about deregulating global banks and corporations. And that's been going on even before the Second World War, but after the Second World War, with the Bretton Woods institutions, this was formalized and set up. Now, it would be, the truth is that the average Tibetan, nomads on the Tibetan plateau, whom I know so well, and I speak their language fluently, they have no idea of the existence of the World Bank or of these trade treaties. Even the majority of people inside the industrialized countries know nothing about these trade treaties and have no idea that this process has led to a situation where deregulated capital and global corporations are shaping not only our politics, but shaping our worldview. They're shaping the discourse of activism. They're shaping the discourse of so-called democracy, of freedom. We need to have we need to step back and look at the bigger picture and look at the connections and very, very definitely and very clearly say no to a further deregulation of these banks and corporations. Now, many people will not argue in a sophisticated, intellectualized way the way you are to say, well, that's not important. Many people will simply say, we don't need to think about it because the system is going to collapse anyway. And that is one of many sets of ideas that allow that system to keep growing. And it's now grown to the point where, as a consequence of that deregulation of global players, 62 people own more wealth than half the global population. We need to be looking at that, and we need to be understanding why and how, and saying no, resisting the further expansion of that, while simultaneously, in an activist way, not in a speedy left brain way, but actively embracing and reconnecting to others and to nature. And that's what I call localization, the rebuilding of those deep relationships of interdependence, which you yourself just mentioned, and which is what indigenous people were all about. So localization is a type of re-indigenization, and it is the way to allow diversity to flourish. Diversity is life. We must adapt to life. And that doesn't mean that we do that wearing the same hat, wearing the same reductionist hat, and employing only our left brain. No, it is about reactivating that part of our body and the older part of our brain to enable us to feel connected, to feel at one with life. So this is, on the other hand, to look at what the TTIP or the TPP means, to understand the ISDS clauses, these investor-state dispute settlements that allow corporations to sue governments if they do anything to protect the environment, to protect their indigenous people, to protect their water, to protect their labor rights. They are being sued by corporations And they're signing in black and white, yes, yes, you may sue us if we do anything so naughty as to do these things which would mean health and well-being for nature and people, but it would impede your profit-making activities. So we agree, we'll sign in black and white. You can sue us if we do that. That's what's happening. Of course, we must urgently put on our speedy hat, put on our reductionist hat to get the word out, not embodying that system to do it, with clarity standing apart from it, but there is a speed that's required there. And I so agree with you. You know, I've said many times myself, we need to hurry up to slow down, but not as individuals. We have to change the I to a we. That for me is a cornerstone of the new activism, changing the I to a we. Part of the hegemony, part of the sort of brainwashing is to keep everything on the level of what can I do as an individual, not what can we do as a community, what can we do as a group. And here we're talking about a we, a collective group of people saying, no, we're not going to allow our representatives to sign away our water, our jobs, and our rights.
So I agree with almost everything you said, Helena. In fact, I'm finding it difficult not to agree with most of what you said. I think where we take depart from different spaces or different points is in regard to the question, with regards to the question, how do we respond today? How do we respond to melting glaciers and the corruption of our public systems and the imploding confidence in institutions? How do we respond to exterminations and exclusions and death today? And this is where I think there's a different kind of analysis is called for. So this man called Foucault talked about how the world is a perpetuation of many binaries. It's me versus you, man versus woman, feminine versus masculine, language versus reality. And I always laugh when you call me a postmodernist. I'm so not, I'm totally not a postmodernist. I like to say I'm a post-postmodernist, or I'm a post-humanist, so to speak. And even those labels are unsatisfactory. Well, he said, there's a crucial binary that is still lingering and still informs most of what we do in the activist world. It's the binary of the public versus the private sphere. And I think you may have hinted at this. It's, in this way, the social life is configured around the idea that people have to be represented. And so some people are the social actors, but what is really tangible, what is really vital is the representative caucus, and a deeper layer, another layer of responsibility. That's the public sphere. And that's why we have Congress and Senate and Facebook. People feel the need to be represented, to come out there, to put themselves out there. And it's a binary that is probably troublesome and problematic, but most people don't notice it today because it displaces the vibrancy of our private lives, so to speak. It cuts it short. And activism operates on that trope. I was in a conference last year as well, I think in Johannesburg, and I remember the group I was talking with, I was in a circle, and I remember everyone feeling a sense almost at the same time. We were talking about poverty and how to heal the world and stuff like that, the convenient ideas and themes. And everyone kind of felt a certain rush of emotion. Like, here we are in a 5-star hotel, having the time of our lives, eating all we can have, and we're talking about people who have no food. It just seemed so phony and so removed from the complexities of our real lives. And maybe that's why I've been saying no to some invitations right now. But the thing is, I feel that the departure point for most of activism is grossly inadequate to the challenge we face today. It means that we have to kind of play the same power script that modernity has shaped. We have to take the high road to the central table and then appeal or advocate. But in doing that, we displace the vibrancy of our lives. And that's the white power that I'm speaking about. That's the gentrification of political action that I speak about. So resistance seems to be playing the same tropes, or seems to be recalling and perpetuating the same dynamics that we're trying to move away from. It seems that the more we resist, and I think Camilla must have spoken about this. I mean, one of the amazing things that I like to hear Camilla speak about is how the climate change movement actually made matters worse. I mean, with the call for cap and trade and all that, and how that has doubled down on itself and made us treat the world as if it's a quantifiable mass of value, and all we can do to it is just quantify it, and that will solve the problem. The thing for me is, how do we respond today? And I just feel that there's a larger project, a larger anthropocentric project that we need to be talking about as well. And that anthropocentric project is the idea that we are alone in the world. We're cut off from everything else. The non-human world has no agency. It's mute. It's non-agential. It has no cause. It has no responsibility. And we alone are the responsible elements in the world. And we have to fix it. And the way we fix it is to get the word out there, or to get to the powers that be and tell them to stop doing what they're doing. And while I don't disagree with that, I feel it doesn't quite touch on the kind of response that we can do today. So let me just say this before you dive in, Helena, because I know this would open up more things. A colleague of mine, if I would call her that, Karen Barad is her name, she would say that there are no solutions. There's only an opening to there's only an opening to an ongoing materialization of the world. And I see that as an invitation to move away from the same old reactionary, dynamics that we've kind of put at the center of the discourse on what we can do to make the world a better place. I feel that we've excluded, in trying to solve most of our problems, we've excluded a whole lot of other responses that are possible. And that is part of the techno-economic, political, epistemological crisis that I'm talking about. It's not just political, it's not out there, external, already set. It's an ongoing production. The system that we talk about, it's a production of a certain kind of way of seeing the world. There are other ways of seeing the world. There are other indigenous responses that see the world. And I saw someone there write that, why don't we slow down? If I could give an example. There's this friend that Charles has that he sent, he brought my way, and her name is Cynthia Jers. And she was, I think her story is that she was very, very concerned about the environment and the way the world is going and climate change. And she sought the help of a shaman, I think, or some kind of healer or elder. And if I can remember correctly, if my memory serves me well, I think he said to her that she should take earthen pots and plant them in the earth everywhere she goes. And she talked to herself and said, that's not a response. A proper response should be to get the word out, to go out there and tell the world or tell the UN that they're doing this or they're making space for this to happen. It's to raise placards and go to the face of Monsanto and say your GM products are hurting us. That's the kind of response I was looking for. But that's not what she got. She was invited to do something that might seem to you, Helena, as an individual response. But it didn't quite touch on the problem as she saw it. But the question again is, what is the problem? What is happening? What if the enemy that we're trying to bring down is part of the spiritual crisis, or part of the maturing that we need, the materialization that needs to happen for us to evolve as a species, or evolve into a different kind of trope, or different kind of dynamic, or different kind of landscape. No, I'm not saying that. So this might seem very stultifying to political action. Like, let's just sit at home and sing Kumbaya. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying the response in the spirit of localization has to be based on how we see, or how we arise from our own epistemological conditions. And that cannot always fit a single stereotype of respondents, so to speak. Yeah.
I think again, for me, what you're doing is conflating these two realities. So if you reduce it down to a simpler level, and you I was going to say, there's a forest fire that threatens to engulf your whole region, then
Yeah.
you need to link hands across that region to put that fire out, and it requires quick action. Well, that's akin to Monsanto insisting on planting vast monocultures of genetically modified organisms that are then polluting the farms around them. That requires a type of resistance that is very different from how do we grow food on our farm? How do we grow food in Nigeria or in California on the Tibetan Plateau? There is an absolute need to distinguish between these two questions. What is it we need to say no to, and what do we say yes to? The yes
but
has
Helena,
to involve many, many countless differences, and none of us can stand on a soapbox and determine what the yeses should be. But there is
yeah.
a very great need to say a clear, united no to a system which embodies, it's an embodiment of hegemony, it's an embodiment of this reductionist and arrogant system. And in 1,001 ways, we end up supporting that system. And we end up supporting it when we say we're not willing to say no to it. We're supporting
But Helena, I think what I'm drawing your attention to is how even saying no. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not against saying no, but I'm speaking about the very curious ways that even saying no plays into the response paradigm of the systems that we're trying to overtake, or we're
So
trying
you
to
say, what do
dismantle
you
or
do? What do you
deconstruct.
recommend then when Monsanto is wanting to, to spray or to plant a huge monoculture in your region? What is your response to that?
I think my response is to stay with the trouble.
It seems to be to stay with it.
Yeah. Now, when I say to stay with it, I'm also, so this is a different part of my of what I think I want to share here, is that there is a tendency for these kind of responses to become to just knee-jerk reactions to already established problems, so that we're cut off from the immediacy
Yeah,
of
I agree
that
with that.
kind of.
Let me, I mean, I completely agree with that. And this is also why, in studying the situation in dozens of different countries, and in 50 different language groups, communicating with people from all over the world, it's becoming so clear that it is not so productive to just in individual regions try to stave off or say no to that very visible and obvious threat. We need to be going upstream. We need to go upstream to be far more sophisticated, far more holistic, to say a clear no to the driving mechanism of the system. And it is an interconnected system of banks and corporations, not inhabited by evil people. It's not about good guys and bad guys. The people inside Monsanto are not that dissimilar to people working in a small family restaurant as people, but they belong in this system which is driving a type of growth, is a very real, very tangible, and very, very destructive direction towards increasing energy consumption while destroying jobs, pushing every business through subsidies, through incentives, through taxes, through regulations, to employ more energy and technology instead of employing people, to impose a way of doing things that speed things up in a horrific way, so that everyone is running faster and faster after the system. So we need to be looking in a very calm, in a very holistic way. How does this system operate, and what can we do to counter it? What can we do to say no to it? And there, what I'm saying is, we're talking about a very different form of activism. I still prefer to embrace the term activism, to say we do need to take action, but not the conventional, what you call knee-jerk reaction or knee-jerk action. Let's step back, let's breathe, let's look, and what do we see? Let's communicate that so that we build up the awareness of the need to move beyond the immediate and downstream reactions, which we don't have time for anymore because there are so many of them. We need to, I think that part of what needs to happen for the new activism is a deep psychological assessment of how this dominant growth economy affects us. People, particularly in the Western world, are not facing up to the truth that the young people today have been subjected to unbelievable stress at school. They're herded into a situation of intense competition, over intellectualization. It's an educational system that's a disaster, and it's linked to an economic job situation where the number of jobs is being shrunk as we speak. They're being concentrated in larger and larger cities. And young people who are being herded into the educational institutions and then looking for jobs find themselves in big cities, from Jakarta to New Delhi to New York or London. The house prices are completely out of reach, but where the jobs are, the house prices are such that you can't afford them. So there are now young couples where one partner works full-time just to pay the rent, and they just manage to survive in this intensely competitive and unpleasant environment. The end result is the suicide rate, an epidemic of anxiety. Now, part of the new activism is examining this system. What are the connections? Why is there such a scarcity of jobs? Why do we have this educational situation? What is the link between urbanization and education? What is the link between that systemic direction and massive environmental problems, massive increases in energy consumption? Just yesterday, we put on our Facebook page, the USDA has approved 3 or 4 new chicken processing plants in China, so that chickens will be flown from the US to China to be processed and then flown back again. This is part of a system that is destroying the planet, that's destroying our jobs, and we urgently need to understand that system and to communicate it. And we need to communicate the incredible price to our well-being. I think particularly, asking parents to really look at the impact on their children, to look at the epidemic of anxiety, the suicide rate, and to ask themselves, are they willing to join a movement, a people's movement, that is going to say no to that continued escalation, and join us in the International Alliance for Localization to start pressuring for a shift. And the beautiful thing is, part of the activism we're talking about is that we can raise awareness about the incredible demonstrations of localization in action. There are, particularly in the local food movement worldwide, demonstrations that small diversified farms produce more food per acre of land than large monocultures. We have now example after example of doctors, lawyers, uh, people, bankers who are leaving their highly paid jobs to farm because they actually enjoy the work on more localized, smaller scale, diversified farms. So there's a movement out there demonstrating that we can do things differently. And the
Yeah,
difference
yeah.
is not one way. The difference is millions of different ways. It's about diversity, it's about smaller scale, it's about slowing down. So the new activism for me is about raising awareness. It's about the big picture, and we need to get it out there as fast as we can. And
And
yeah,
I
sorry.
agree. I agree, Helena. I totally agree. And I think in broad strokes, you've partially painted the kind of activism. I'm very hesitant to use the word new because of its denigration of the
Ancient
word old.
futures. Yeah, ancient futures. Yeah.
But and I just until yesterday, I've been playing with the word post-activism, but I would like to call it a compost activism, around the compost heap. Like people need to get to the hot and sexy places um, where not to get there like it's somewhere, but in the heat of those kinds of conversations that you talk about, of questioning, of leaning in, of assuming postures of curiosity, of sitting at the intersection points, of dealing with our limits again. See, I'm noticing that people feel a need. Activism just seems like a linear trajectory from our intention to the world that we think is possible. But the I think the kind of politics that is called for right now invites us to notice our limitations, invites us to grieve, to take account of death as part and as resonant with life itself. That's what I'm speaking about. It's about just moving away from the on-off switch, the binary, the dichotomized response that we've been used to. And that's a creature of modern power. Let's say yes to this or let's say no. Let's say yes to this or let's say no. I'm saying there's a third response. There are other places of power. And I think you've beautifully encapsulated in some ways what it means to slow down. Because most people will say it's urgent, let's speed it up. But it this is okay, and I like to give this an example, and this will probably be my final word before the Q&A. And it's okay. I read a report recently about a cancer research center in Ohio that have discovered a way to bring the flu or as a cure to cancer. I don't have the details, but
It's a
they're
virus.
working
It's a
on it.
virus.
It's a
They're
virus,
using a
yes. It's
virus that eats the
using a
cancer.
virus to and,
Yeah.
and that just speaks to me about how mangled our histories are, how even what we claim to be enemies or the other, the exteriorized other, could be part of our mattering or of our materialization to something else. And that's why, and I think there's no there could be no stronger argument about why we should slow down, because we could be excluding part of the conversation and insisting that the only way we could respond is to resist. And I'm saying basically that resistance, we could think of a thicker, broader way of reclaiming what resistance means. It could actually embrace renewal, a slowing down, a thinking about what is happening, a thinking about what we're exposed to, and a thinking about how we respond to it. Well, those are the broad strokes. There are more
Well,
details that I think I can.
I think that we are to a great extent in agreement. I guess to me it looks as though it's mainly a difference in language. You would prefer to see resistance embracing renewal. I think it actually helps to separate them out intellectually to have greater clarity. Um, and yet it may come down to almost the same thing. You would prefer not to talk about the new activism, but rather about a sort of compost or post activism. And I think the language difference is not perhaps so important. I think we're in agreement that we do need to be thinking about these issues and we need to do something about them. And I think in
Yeah.
suggesting education as activism, I also want
Oh,
to
I
stress
agree.
that
I
I'm talking
agree.
about a very, very different politics. I think for the political change we need to move away from a narrow national discourse to a much broader, big picture,
Yes.
global understanding, and at the
And
same
it
time, much
put it this
deeper,
way,
more
Helena.
localized. Sorry, let me finish. A much
Yeah.
deeper, embedded, localized understanding. And so we're talking about a very different form of doing things. So I'm okay with the idea that we might use different language.
Okay. Okay.
So,
It's
oh, yeah, go ahead. Maybe one more comment, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Yeah, so yes, the issue about language is recognized. I think we express it differently, but there's also the I also want to recognize that it's what I think I'm trying to articulate is how um, contemporary activism seems to be the continued subjectivization of people. It's how modern power frames power and excludes other powers from mattering. And what is called for today, and I think localization is really a beautiful trope to explore. It's a beautiful place to sit in and explore what we could do together. But I wanted to introduce the epistemological aspect of it, that how we even frame the problem is part of the problem, and how we respond to the problem is also part of the problem. These are not external responses. They are simultaneously entangled with the problem that we think is already out there. So basically, I just want to say that justice is always in the making. Justice is not some disembodied element that is out there. We have to sit with the trouble of trying to frame how to respond to this. And I think localization is a beautiful trope to explore around this.
I hate to interrupt this such a lively conversation, but it's definitely time to open it up to everyone else. So if you have a question that you'd like to pose to either Helena or Bayo, please type it into the chat box. And I think we already have one question that someone asked. It just says, Bayo, why don't we slow down? And then example, please.
Yeah, I think I kind of responded to that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I would just say this as well. I remember the first time I spoke that out, given a speech, and there was this humming in the room. I don't mean the spiritual humming. I mean there was a humming of resonance, like people resonated with that, but they didn't quite understand how it could be possible in a world that is urgent, that is pressing on them to do something. And I remember coming back home and someone writing me an email. He said, I'm starting to try to practice slowing down. And what I've done is, um, as I'm typing my memos and submit, because he worked in an NGO, and I'm typing my memos and trying to get through my activities for the day, I'm doing it in a slower fashion. But it doesn't seem to be working because I still have to get it out there on time. And it's one of the things people, I think, fail to understand. It's that the frameworks that create our action or how we think about a problem is the issue here. And I think this is what Helena has been talking about all through the years, that we cannot just think about things in isolation. Like this is a poverty issue, or uh, this is a food issue, or this is a food crisis, or something like that. It's all entangled and connected. But taking this to, I'm not that I'm taking it deeper. I'm also seeking to emphasize that even our actions are entangled with the problems that we see out there. So slowing down is not about reducing the speed of how we do things. It's about noticing other ways of doing things and coming to account for them as well. It's about allowing other spaces of power to be just as relevant as those things that we insist are the only official legitimate ways to respond to the crisis we see in the world today. So maybe the way my friend Chip Richards responded to the problem where he lives in Australia, and I don't know if Helena knows him. He works with Uplift, and
Yeah.
he told me that, yeah, I'm sure you do. He told me that there was a problem with companies dumping plastic where he lives and stuff like that. And the way he decided to respond to that was to do it in the energy of the ocean, was to sit and wait and see what wanted to happen. So there was a kind of passivity involved in that might scare hard-boiled activists and veteran activists, that we must do something immediately. But there was a passivity, there was a waiting, and there was a cultivating of responsibility between the C and Chip. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to happen today, and that wants to happen today. We need to notice that we are not the only ones in the equation. We're not the only agents. We're not even agents in the humanist sense of the word. I feel that it's an entanglement that makes us agents. We need to notice how the non-human world is haunting us and reframing our conversations and, reconfiguring how we respond altogether. And this sitting with the trouble, and that's a phrase that Donna Haraway would popularize, sitting with the trouble, staying at the interjunctions, noticing our limits, is what I feel is a powerful kind of activism today.
So the next question kind of relates to the concept of slowness, which is what does the concept of emergency mean to you as opposed to emergence? And how do you see that this concept of emergency relate to our current situation? Are there not elements of our current eco-social crisis that require immediate and urgent action, even if that action is coming from essentially the same place that created the problem?
I'm going to answer like a politician right now. It's a beautiful question. And I'm also struggling with the question. So what I say has often come across, and when I say, I want to disturb that a bit. It's not what I say, it's what I think is a conversation I think I'm part of. So there are lots of people who speak about this. I'm definitely not the only one. I'm just tapping into that current as well. It seems as if this kind of talk stultifies, and I think I mentioned this with Helena. It seems to be damaging for political action. I mean, most people stand up and say there are children suffering right now. There are people dying right now. And there's a sense in which, and I say this with some hesitation, there's a sense in which we tend to get squeamish about death and dying. But maybe the ways we framed urgency, around doing things right now, cuts out a kind of, okay, I like to say this, and I'm going to use in response, that the material world is promiscuous, and it is always an ethical interruption of our frames of urgency or justice. So that even those things that we think we should be doing immediately, I mean, our elders will say we should still slow down. No, I'm not saying that there's a blanket meta-narrative that everyone must stick by, like there is an ethical undercurrent or there's some kind of cosmic imperative that everyone must follow or else they're going off course. I feel there are particularities that we should be attending to. If my daughter was in a burning house, I wouldn't slow down. I would want to rush in and drag her out immediately. And I see that that's where Helena, the particularities and specificities of what you say, most of that arises from that kind of awareness. But I'm also saying that there are other kinds of awarenesses and other ways of framing the conversation. Let me answer this question again. John's question, John Page, I think, by saying, John, that's John. Okay, let me answer John's question by referring to a story, very brief story before we move ahead, of a group of fishermen off a coast, Brazil, that fish by waiting.
It seems like we lost Bayo.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk.
There he is. He's come.
Okay.
I'm just turning his audio back on. You feel free to weigh in while we get him set up again.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd like to weigh in on that. I think that, again, I am talking about this renewal part as being at least as important as the resistance part. And the renewal side of things is very much about slowing down. It is very much about comprehending that we're part of a larger family. So all the things that you talk about there, Bayo, are very much what I talk about as part of the ancient futures discussion and learning from indigenous culture, and seeing and helping to give birth to countless new localization initiatives that actually allow people to practice and to experience that interdependence and that different way of being. But I think in terms of emergency, I think we do, first of all, we need to realize that just because we have a constructed top-down perspective that's being promoted through almost every source of knowledge, through the media, through academia, through schooling, virtually every source of knowledge except our own intimate experiential knowledge, which has been demonized and displaced in the modern world. That dominant discourse is being framed, yes, in certain quarters in the light of emergency. We must do something now about climate change. And then that's been reduced down to carbon, a tradable commodity. That's not something that was done by activists. That's something that was done by corporate think tanks. That framing into that narrow emergency activism around carbon, which then leads to carbon offsets, carbon trading, and which makes big global corporations wealthier and the majority of people not just poorer, but forced to live in an environment which can barely sustain life. So the framing that we need to be questioning is precisely that top-down monolithic framing that comes from very specific sources. And you know, the main source today of thinking is actually robots, because it's robots and computer algorithms that are determining the value of our currency, the value of our water. What's been set in motion is like a giant machine. And we should not be rushing into trying to break that machine down. No, we should step back, look at that machine, but very, very clearly and consciously look at the various tentacles and the structures and elucidate what's going on so that other people learn about how this system actually functions. In the current situation, most people are simply blaming the other, whether it's the immigrant, whether it's the other religion, whether it's their neighbors. They're blaming government. They're blaming the visible manifestations of the oppression and the problem. But there isn't a framework. There isn't a system. There isn't an organization that's helping people to go beyond that, to see the structures that we're talking about. And that's what I think is a very important part of the new activism, that big picture activism. And equally important to understanding the technoeconomic dynamic and that system is understanding and appreciating life itself, understanding the incredible complexity, understanding that language is a very simple tool that simply cuts a living process into tiny, dead, inert bits. We have to go beyond language, deeper into experiential knowledge in order to comprehend and to feel that. It's not just a question of the brain comprehending, it's to actually feel that complexity and the joy that comes from that. Even in a polluted, toxic world, we need to take joy in each moment, in the leaf that outside your door, that leaf of grass, the leaf on the tree, in every moment is changing. There is no static anything out there. There is this dance of life that we can take joy in and that we can feel a part of. So this, for me, is also part of the new activism. I prefer to keep the language that encourages people to move, not to become static. And so for me, activism is fine as a term for that. I guess for me also the language difference is not so important, because I've discovered in speaking lots of different languages that, as I say, the words are little imperfect symbols for an infinitely complex moving reality behind those words. You know, I always talk about language as a grid over a flow, and it's the flow we need to go with, that we need to flow with.
Helena, can you hear me? Am I back?
Yeah.
So I wish I could just frame what you just said and put it in a picture and hang it on my wall. It's because I like that you speak about going beyond language. And I think in response to John's question, there's some kind of lazy liberalism that has taken over our response to the world. We just sit back behind and think that we could save the planet or write a new story. That's incredibly popular. We can tell a new story, as if it were in our power to just simply word the world into a different kind of being or a different kind of status. And I think that, you know, maybe this is more in direct response to John's question, that when we speak about emergency, there's a political configuration of me versus the other, or me versus a challenge or problem. But emergence is a different framework that says I am the challenge, and I don't mean I in terms of an individual, but I mean that we are entangled with a problem that we're trying to solve. And so there's no easy way to cut it. There's no given way to cut through the problem versus the solution. There's no simple, already predetermined way to approach an issue like climate change. There are material agencies that are involved in shaping what it means for our planet to be getting warmer today that cannot be simply represented or engaged or accounted for by signing documents at the UN. There's something else that is desperately needed. And I think when you speak about joy, Helena, and coming to places of grief or learning the name of a flower, I think, how come that is not so much a part of the conversation today as is getting on the street or traveling all the way to France, like we do all the time, to raise placards and demand. Now, I'm not saying that is rubbish, or I'm not saying that should be downplayed. I'm just saying that we have, at the risk of our own futures, of our own ancient futures, we have sidestepped, we have excluded another way of responding that we should be talking about today. And yeah, that's slowing down for me. That's emergence for me.
And I think also I want to mention that one of the first steps that we recommend in the new activism is that we consciously try to reconnect with some like-minded people in the area where we live. in order to start changing the I to a we, in order to operate on many different levels. This is a new activism in that part of what I addressed earlier is the need to connect much more deeply to one another, to reach out beyond the confines of the tiny nuclear family, to start building a bigger community fabric. And one of the ways to do that can be to show a film in the area where you live, or to, in one way or another, find like-minded people within reach, so that you're beginning to build a new culture. You're going against the dominant grain to build something that's not built on the externalities that this consumer culture is built on, where it's all about being perfect and showing off, whether it's with degrees or fancy cars. This is about actually knowing one another. It is about being a support to one another, which is why it's very important that it should also be place-based, face-to-face, so that when somebody is ill, when somebody does need help with their child or with their aging parent, there will be helping hands there. And these little groups that we've helped to set up in different parts of the world combine, again, the resistance and the renewal. They combine thinking together, trying to understand the dominant system, and looking at what they might do to help get the word out. May only be one or two people in a group that choose to send out regular emails, that might even start a project where they show films regularly in the local area. Sometimes they're artists and they combine music and visual arts to get a different message out. Sometimes they use theater. And very important as part of that activism, from our point of view, is that they do something together that they really enjoy. It may be cooking and eating a meal together. It may be singing. It may be meditating, hiking in nature. But what's happening here is that we're beginning to build little cells of a new culture, a culture that is strengthening, that is part of, if you like, the new story, the new world that people are talking about, while at the same time becoming part of a resistance movement that will be strong enough to actually overcome the power of these giant corporations.
I just want. Yeah, I just want to bring this last question from Bob into the discussion. It's he's offering up one way of kind of framing this debate, which has been, at the heart of a lot of the discussion. He says it seems to be like trying to decide whether to live demonstratively and responsibly, i.e. in a highly localized way, or to be an effective activist, which requires using the damaging tools we have available to us, such as travel and consumption. And he's asking, is there a balance, or should we choose the path that we feel we could be most effective at?
Well, I'll just quickly respond to say that I really think that people should choose the path they feel they'd be most effective at, yes, but also I would like to encourage them to explore the possibility of participating in the resistance side of things, which would involve some traveling and what we sometimes call using the master's tools. I think there's so much to talk about, but I think that part of the dominant discourse is to make people feel that they should not be driving a car, they should not be using a computer, they should virtually live in the dark and, go completely local. Now that really suits the system if we disempower ourselves that way. We need to communicate, we need to share visions and stories, and so there is a great need, particularly for a deeper dialogue between the global north and the global south, and that does require face-to-face exchange and experiential knowledge, and that is something that requires travel, and I think Traveling as a consumer tourist is a bit hard to justify today, but not traveling if you want to learn and share and collaborate. So the
Can I
answer
respond to that
is
as well?
yes, please.
So Bob, I think anything we do, okay, let me start out this way. That I think this, I might first just build some affinity with you and say that it's my struggle as well. And last year I did so much traveling that I remember being on a train and I just started to cry because I'd been so far, I almost lost the feel of how my daughter's face was, and I started to miss them terribly. I'd been through 3 or 4 countries in Europe, and I started to feel like I need to be home right now. And why am I doing this anyway? I could just be at home right now with them. Isn't that what localization is all about? And so it's also my struggle, and I feel it's the struggle of most people out there. But I like to bring a different kind of analysis, and only briefly. So there's a sense in which we carry on a notion of nature or what ought to be in our minds when we approach issues about change or difference. So this touches on our concept of the nature of nature, or the kinds of stories that we tell other stories with. So probably during that time I was, traveling, I told myself what ought to be the case. What is natural is for me to be with my family, is to be at home. And what is unnatural is that I'm using all these technologies, I'm using all these tools, I'm on my tab all the time trying to respond to email while I travel. That seems to be unnatural. But I feel that there is a danger in trying to, stabilize nature as a certain kind of narrative to the exclusion of others. I like to say that nature is its own deconstruction. And so there is no tool that is, that's another binary that we use all the time, agent versus tool. I feel that there is no damaging tool. And Helen likes to speak about this all the time, about using the master's tools. I used to struggle with it, but I think I'm in a good place right now. There is no already predetermined set of tools that are evil and that we should move away from. I feel anything we do in the world today, every kind of response that we will try to do or make will be fraught with contradictions, will be fraught with edges and limitations. And it's how to live with them. I don't think there is a convenient platonic balance that we could strike as if we were aligning ourselves with a cosmic narrative. I don't think that's possible. I feel that the world is constantly re-engineering itself, constantly experimenting with itself. And we're part of that experimentation. So if you find yourself doing a lot of travel, I don't think it means something deeper than that you're traveling at the moment. And if you feel that that's a kind of response that you want to offer the world at this time, then I feel that that's what the world is doing through you or with you at that point in time. So yes, I agree with Helena in saying that sometimes the master's tools will dismantle the master's house. And we shouldn't get into a fix or get too squeamish about falling on different side of things, because there is no side of things.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our webinar, and we'll certainly continue, Bayo, with our discussions, and perhaps maybe do another webinar, because there's so much more to talk about. And yeah, at so many different levels. And particularly when we get into discussion of the role of language and into the more mystical side of things, it's layer upon layer. So it's a delight to talk to you with your brilliant mind, Bayo, and let's continue soon again. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Helena. And my love to John Page.